Welcome, friends, to another Before You Read lecture. This is the second of two lectures on the book of Revelation. This one will provide some guidance for Revelation 12 through 22. In this Before You Read lecture, I want to provide a brief recap of some of the things I discussed in the first lecture that are important for this material. Then I want to provide something of an outline to this material, to the various visions and components of Revelation 12 through 22. And then I want to discuss the violence, the violent imagery in this part of Revelation in particular, although it's true of earlier parts as well. And then I want to conclude, as I do always, with a few suggestions about and some questions for you to consider as you read. To begin with a brief recap, remember that Revelation as a form of apocalyptic literature is visionary literature, that it provides access to a divine perspective on human events, and that it is in large part crisis literature, responding to a particular crisis, a moment of crisis in history, and that as we are reading it through an analogical mode, we are hoping to make connections between the first century context of Revelation and our own context as 21st century readers, most of whom are reading in the United States. Remember also that there is a cyclical cycle of, sequence of 7 that we see 3 of in Revelation 6 through 16. And there were themes in this material related to God's sovereignty and worship and other things that are important for us. In terms of the outline of this material, it is a bit more difficult to outline. It has less of the structure, maybe, than we saw in the first 11 chapters of Revelation. Nevertheless, we can break it into the following parts. In chapters 12 through 14, there are a variety of visions. In chapters 15 and 16, we have the final sequence of 7. Then in chapters 17 through 19, we might describe this as the fall of Babylon. And I think Babylon is usually interpreted as a symbolic name for Rome. We can discuss that and think about that. And then in chapter 20, we have what I would call the final judgment scenes. This is when the devil and the devil's adversary or associates are finally judged and brought to justice. And then in chapters 21 and 22, we have this powerful and incredible vision of the new heaven and the new earth. Like I said, I want to say a few things about the violent language in Revelation. I think that this is probably one of the things that most people who are reading Revelation for the first or second time find most disturbing. And my own thinking on this has been greatly impacted by Dr. Alan Bozak, who was a South African New Testament scholar. And in his book, Comfort and Protest, he simply points out that for those who have never been under the thumb of an oppressive government system, those who have never experienced pronounced and long-term marginalization, the language of Revelation can be very unsteadying. It can be disconcerting and even damaging, we might say. But for those who have experienced marginalization and oppression, they are able to identify with the language of Revelation in a different way and ultimately see it as a hopeful document rather than a terrifying document. And so I think that that's an important framework for understanding the sacred violence, the violent language in Revelation. A second metaphor that I think is important as a framework comes from the New Testament scholar Brian Blunt, who teaches New Testament, who's the president of the Presbyterian Seminary in Virginia. And what Brian Blunt uses is this image of farming. And that if you are a farmer and you are wanting to turn over a farm for a new crop, you must first tear up that old crop. You must first aerate the soil. And that this newness requires a certain destructive element. And that from the perspective of Revelation, The world and its systems are so bent towards evil and injustice that a similar destructive process must precede the new creation. And so it's not destructive for the sake of destruction. It's not violent for the sake of violence. But it is this process of recreating that which is bent towards evil and injustice. And I think that that's a very helpful framework for understanding the book of Revelation and some of its violent imagery. Let me also say just 4 additional things, 4 on violence in Revelation. And the first is to consider John's situation and the situation of the churches he addresses. That they were experiencing pronounced suffering, real suffering, the loss of loved ones, the loss of freedom, the loss of possessions. And that the John's situation, that crisis situation, also has some connections with the imprecatory psalms, the psalms of damnation, or the mean psalms, if you will, like Psalm 33 or 55, 69, 109, or 137, where the psalmist speaks out violently against God's enemies, but ultimately it's an act of saying, God, you need to take care of this. I'm not going to act. I can't do this, but I'm calling on you to act against my enemies. And then alongside John's individual situation, we might remember that this is a community pushed to the edge. It is a community experiencing crisis. And so this is language of trauma and a community in deep need of assistance. The second thing that I would point out about the violence in Revelation is that that Revelation is using earlier tradition. There's a whole tradition in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, as well as in the ancient Near Eastern world, about the combat myth, about God defeating Leviathan, or God defeating the chaos of the sea in creation. And that's being drawn on in this portion of Revelation. There's also what I would call an apocalyptic scheme or an apocalyptic timeline that often includes things getting worse and worse and worse up until the time when God's judgment finally comes. We also have language from Scripture that includes things like the plagues, right? The plagues in the book of Exodus. That language is repurposed in the book of Revelation. Or God's wrath, the power and fright of God's judgment, even the power and fright of God's appearance, as we see elsewhere in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. And so this is all, I think, reappropriated in Revelation. Doesn't necessarily eliminate the violence or make it any more palatable, but it does at least say that it is part of a biblical and extra-biblical tradition. The third thing that I would point out about violence in Revelation is John's use of language. It's important for us to recognize just how visionary and metaphorical this language is. While other texts do and could name actual enemies, Revelation is prone to descriptive, symbolic, and metaphorical language to describe the enemies of the community and the enemies of God. And this is so important that some have actually questioned whether or not real human beings actually experience violence in the book of Revelation. Now that's a point of contestation, that's a point of conversation. But I think it is really important for us to remember that the use of visionary and metaphorical language puts a gap, a small gap maybe, but a gap between symbolic violence and actual violence. And then I think related to that, there is this really strong insider and outsider language in Revelation. And I think Eugene Boring, a New Testament scholar, has pointed out that the language of Revelation functions to make only one point: God's protective care for the confessing worshiper. And I think that that's a good emphasis on this, is that the emphasis is on God's care, not on God's violence against outsiders. The fourth thing and final thing that I would say about violence in Revelation is John's own theology that comes through it. And with this, we learn that for John, the universality and the ubiquity of human sin is such that it requires a huge response on the part of God. And again, that language that Blunt uses of turning a field over is helpful here. The whole field needs to be reworked. It needs to be recreated. And some of the violence in Revelation is symbolic of that new creation. I think it's also important for us to remember that all of the traditional language that is used and the sort of end times, it's going to get worse before it gets better, all of that is refracted through the central conviction of Jesus as a slain lamb. And that whatever we say about violence in Revelation must be interpreted through the lamb, a symbol of docility, a symbol of peace, a symbol of vulnerability, who has been sacrificed, who has yielded himself to the powers that be in order to be raised to new life. That whatever we say about divine violence and violence in Revelation, that it needs to be interpreted through that story of Jesus's nonviolent resistance. And then finally, we need to maintain that there is this tension between this violent imagery in Revelation and this violent imagery expressed towards the enemies of God and the enemies of the community with these scenes of universal salvation. So even after all of this crazy stuff has happened on earth, Revelation still maintains in the final chapters that all of the nations of the earth are going to stream to the New Jerusalem and they're going to be healed. And so it really is difficult for us to take that literally, that if all of the people are killed earlier in Revelation, then how can they come at the end? And so again, I think that this is a tension that we need to hold as we read Revelation. Let me conclude with just a few questions to help you engage this material on your own. First, what do these chapters, these final chapters in Revelation, reveal about human evil and power structures and God's response to both? Second question, what do these chapters reveal about the nature and function of worship? Third, what do these chapters tell us about God's role in directing history? To what end is God directing history? And finally, what is the nature of hope that is espoused by chapters 11 or 12 through 22? Do you think it's only an otherworldly, end of the world sort of hope? Or does it enable a sort of hope in this life as well? Thank you so much, as always, for your attention. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on Revelation 12 through 22. Now, happy reading.